today in Rich in Relationship.
We're going to unpack why you and your partner may have the same goals, but you kind of go at them in a different way. Sometimes that even feels contrary. Men would normally harvest more than a woman, but now a woman can harvest just as much as a man. A woman can produce just as much as a man. We need to be watching out to our families. We need to be prepared to be warriors when a warrior is called for, and we need to be gentle lambs when it comes to our family. Welcome to another episode of Rich in Relationship, and today we're going to talk about why men and women see the world differently, or the roots of differences. And in the last episode, we talked a lot about the feminine side and feminine and masculinity, and I'm making a real effort here to honor some of the choices people are making about how they express themselves, whether they're expressing themselves to the masculine, through the feminine, or what we're now coming to know as non-binary. And so forgive me if I flip between the talking about men and women and talking about masculinity and femininity. I'm kind of stretching my own brain is what I'm doing. And if it's straining yours a little, forgive me if I'm getting it wrong, let me know, because I'm looking to grow here. I'm looking to really embrace and understand what's happening in my ecology, right? I'm embracing my feminine side. I want to understand my ecology and I want to connect. And this is what this episode is all about, how these two approaches show up so differently. What is the root of the difference between you and your partner? Why does she always want to talk about feelings? Why does he always want to work instead of focusing on us? You know, a lot of guys I work with feel like they're constantly missing the mark in their relationship. They're trying so hard. And a lot of the women that I work with feel like they've done everything they can to let their guy know what they feel like is going on, and they don't understand how their guy just doesn't get it. We're going to explore that in depth in this episode. Last episode, we talked about masculine and feminine sides. We touched on some of what we're going to talk on today in the last episode. It's going to be a little redundant, but you just got to get it. If you're somebody who's been following this all the way through, great. If you're just tuning in for this episode and you didn't hear the last episode, you're going to be a little lost unless I rehash. So for those of you who listen to every episode, there's going to be some rehashing. Here's the deal. Society is changing faster and faster. And it has changed super quickly. And that change started really in the 1920s. But the truth is that human beings emotionally have not kept up with the changes. And I'm not just talking about, having a cell phone as opposed to having a hardwired phone or having no phone at all. I'm talking about the pace of life. I'm talking about the rapidity with which quality is being achieved. And that requires a lot of emotional shifting and changes. It's kind of like this thing that we see in corporations. We've all been around corporations where they talk about inclusion. And they do a great job of talking about inclusion, but they don't actually incorporate it very well into their structure, into their systems. There's still a lot of institutionalized exclusion. However, you want to think about that, whether it be on a class, whether it be on sex, whether it be on race or whatever. And so there's this process going on where the language is out of sync with the action. And that's happening everywhere in society, not just on the corporate level. It's happening in many partnerships. In fact, I would argue that in a healthy partnership, when two individuals are changing and growing, the way that they're saying things is changing and the way that they're hearing things is changing. And so when two individuals are changing and growing rapidly, the level of communication and redefining terms needs to be upped with frequency. Otherwise, there's misunderstanding. And what most of us slip into in our relationships is we take the communication and the relationship for granted, forgetting that people change, forgetting that society is changing rapidly, forgetting that the societal changes drive individual changes. And if we don't keep if our relationship doesn't keep up with that, communication stops working. And that's why people like me have a job. Sad, but true. So today we're going to talk about the history of that. I want you guys to get how different things are. And actually, I think there are a lot of movies that do a good job of this, but not always such a good job of this. Because the problem with movies is they try and take historical material and relate it to us in a way that we can receive it. And so if they spoke in the language of that time of history, or if they spoke in the understanding and concepts of that time in history, we might not get it, or it might not excite us. And so that what happens a lot when we're watching historical movies, and this happens all the time for me. I'm watching a historical movie, something set in in the 70s, which is actually a time I was alive, but it's the movie's being produced for someone who was maybe born in the 70s or 80s and didn't live through that time. And the languaging and the way people are talking to each other is much more current. It may have some of the jargon of the 70s, but not the actual language and feeling of the 70s, because the emotional evolution of individuals in society in the 70s was different than the emotional evolution of individuals in society today. And for us to watch a movie and enjoy it, it has to be mostly phrased in our terminology and language. The reason why we no longer have medieval movies where people go thee and thou and your highness and speak in the language of that time is people couldn't watch it. And so even historical movies tend to be couched in the language of our time. All right, so what I want to illustrate for you is what it was like then and why on the inside, masculinity and femininity, the expression of masculinity and the expression of femininity, or being a man and being a woman, haven't changed or kept up with the times that as well as they could. And that's kind of our mission here is we want to get you thinking about this. We want to get you challenging yourself. We want to get you, if you're a guy, to lean into your femininity more, if that's something you're not already doing. And if you're a gal, leaning into your masculinity in a way that doesn't contradict or subvert your femininity. We want to create parity and balance within ourselves so that we have relationships that are based on parity and balance. So it's only been a few generations since the big shift began in our society. Like for thousands of years, men and women operated on survival-based roles. Really, I keep saying up to the 1920s. It might even be the 1900s. But the truth is that for a long time, it was, I'm going to eat what I kill today. I'm going to make enough money for today. I may put away enough money for the future, but it's going to be scraping and saving. There was not the kind of luxury that we have today. And let me give you an illustration, all right? The reason why I keep going back to the 1920s is I think the Great Depression was the cultural and financial wake-up call for society. In the Great Depression, people were like dying of starvation. And yet there were incredible resources available. Society was producing food and automobiles and technology and things for people to use and clothing, like the basic necessities, were being produced at a rate unseen in the history of mankind. And yet there were people living in homeless camps. And yet there were people starving. And yet there were people who were willing to work and could not work. And this was like a huge wake-up call. We were like, oh my God, we can't ever let this happen again. So now, since the Great Depression, our society we've had recessions and we've seen people struggle. We still have ongoing homelessness. We still have people living in tents, but not the huge tent camps. There were people living in Central Park in New York City in huge camps, and nobody was stopping them because they had no place else to live. And it was recognized that this was a problem that needed to be solved. Now we have that happening on a smaller scale. We have setbacks. We have an economic downturn. But we do pretty much ensure that at least in this country, in the United States of America, everybody eats. That's not happening in the world. Sadly, it could happen in the world, and it hasn't yet, without getting political. All right, so the big shift from the 20s to now was we need to revamp production of food, clothing, shelter. The big thing was that every American should have a house and 2 chickens in every pot and 2.5 kids, and everyone should be able to work. That was like the goal from the end of the Depression through, let's call it, the 60s. Huge shift, great accumulation of wealth. huge shift in society. And with the means of production, the role of men and women changed. In a survival world where you're living in a tent camp, you, your wife, and kids. Just imagine you're living in a tent camp in a park, you, your wife, and your kids, and you're having trouble getting food. You're going out to work. You might be working one day a week if you're lucky. Your wife, her safety in that tent, and your kids, their safety in that tent is predicated on two things. It's predicated on your ability to kick ass or to have allies who will help you kick ass. And most alliances in cultures are built by the feminine side, as we talked about in the last episode, right? This is where you really get to imagine. We're not talking about caveman crap. We're talking about real life here. The caveman stuff, we don't even know how real it is. So we've made up a story about cavemen based on how we live today. If you looked at tent communities, women are building a network of safety for their children and themselves. They're bringing in alliances for the men who have shared goals, at least, and similar values, if not the same values. And safety is created in that environment. And if a fight breaks out, it's the man who goes out and fights, not the woman. If food needs to be cooked, it's the woman who manages the food and makes sure that it's distributed appropriately and that everybody eats. The woman who makes sure that the tent is comfortable, the man who makes sure that there's something that she can provide comfort with, right? In a survival environment, that's how things were cut up. Whether you like it or not, whether it's good or bad, whether that's sexism or not, really doesn't matter. That's how it was during the Depression, right? Really, and everything that we have comes out of that experience. The mindset of actually, my grandparents came out of that experience. My parents were impacted by that. And even my generation is impacted that. My kids are impacted by the impact of all of them through me to them. So society ramps up production. It sets up systems so that we can have recessions but not depressions, we hope. Fingers crossed that'll never happen again. Government systems, banking systems, production systems, ways of storing food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And because heavy labor on the production side has been mechanized, a woman can now operate a harvester and harvest stuff in the field. Not that women can't harvest, but men would normally harvest more than a woman. But now a woman can harvest just as much as a man. A woman can produce just as much as a man. And so the whole argument for I'm the provider, I go out and do this, you're the nest builder, that whole rug has been pulled out. Now we have stay-at-home dads because women can actually earn more than their husbands. They might have a better education. They might have utilized their skills better at another time than their husband, and now become nest builders. Women become providers. And the essential cultural wiring of what a man is and of what a woman is, though it has changed consciously, is still present unconsciously. We are 80 or 90% unconscious mind. In our unconscious mind, the strategies and seeds and relationships of the past still exist to some extent. Remember how I told you my grandparents were massively impacted by the Depression? My parents grew up as children out of that with their parents' experience of that. My parents' concept of men and women came from their parents' concept of men and women. I'm raised by them. My concept of man and woman is impacted by my parents. My parents don't have maybe this quite the same men do this and women do this idea that their parents did, but it's still there because their parents had it. It's been put in them. That seed is passed on even to current generations. There's a seed. And add to that, go back to our previous episode on how brains and testosterone operate versus the way brains and estrogen operate, right? And you've got something out of sync. Society functionally has evolved to the point where men and women can do pretty much the same things in terms of productivity, food, in terms of caring for children. And that is a wonderful thing. I got a son-in-law who is showing up for my grandson in a way that is unprecedented because of the opportunities that his job, my daughter's job, give them and allow them to do. It's a beautiful thing. He is an awesome father. He cares for that child in a very different way than his mother does. The connection that child has with him is very different than the connection that child has with the mother. Why? Because he is still an animal that is testosterone based versus estrogen based. She is still, even though she can make more money, even though she can produce at the same level as a man in the same job, maybe better in some ways, maybe worse in others, even though all that's true, the wiring of their brains is still there. She tends to be more environmental. He tends to be more linear. She's more sensitive to emotional shifts. He's less. How does that impact the child? Really, we are yet to find out. And I suspect it goes like this. I suspect because she's more sensitive to emotional shifts, as children, as they grow, practice exercising power through expressing emotion, there may be a different interplay going on with her than with him. He may just gloss over an emotion, and the child may not try that as a tactic anymore. I'm not talking about consciously. I'm just talking about experientially. Even though men and women are equal, they do things differently. And the challenge here is that the traditional roles of men and women have basically been wiped out, but we still have the wiring to do things in masculine and feminine ways. Now, there have been some maladaptive adaptations. We talked about this in previous episodes. We've talked about 6 or 7 different models of maladaptive masculine behavior. We've talked about toxic masculinity. That's sort of going back to the TED Camp days. Hey, babe, you're not going to be safe without me. Do what I say and everything's going to be all right. We've talked about the nice guy syndrome. Talked about that a lot in the last episode, and we talked about in the previous episodes, where the guy is trying to be accommodating, and what he experiences femininity as being in some ways, trying to be emotionally present, but not really succeeding because he's doing it in a masculine way. We've talked about a lot of the feminine maladaptive behaviors. All right. I've talked about women who have adopted the alpha. They go to work and they take names and kick ass. And then they come home and they take names and kick ass. Or they come home and they don't know how to be environmental anymore because they've been taking names and kicking ass so much. Right. The different maladaptive behaviors. Right. The culture, even though the production mode promotes ecology, the culture still has a male stamp on it in many ways. That hasn't been shifted completely yet. We're still, these institutions, the rules, the systems of the institutions are still shifting and changing to accommodate this, because we, the human beings who create and drive those systems, are shifting and changing. So in the same way that we have maladaptive behaviors in our marriages, the institutions have maladaptive behaviors. In the last episode, we talked about, or maybe it was this episode, I don't know if they all roll together. We've talked about inclusion, the word versus the action. The result is stress and confusion. Stress and confusion on the institutional level, frustration. And in the marriage, right? In the marriage, there hasn't been a lot of communication. The two individuals are growing and changing. They haven't figured out how to express their masculine and feminine sides at the same time in a way that's balanced and healthy, and it muddles up the communication. Here's an example. A man who was raised by a father who was a sole provider might feel inadequate if his wife out-earns him, while his wife, raised to be independent, may struggle to soften and let him lead in certain areas. The way that we're raised by our parents who don't have the same take on what equality means that we do is going to impact, we might overcompensate. And the combination of the overcompensation is what leads to discord. It's what leads to disharmony. It's what leads to the fighting. It's what leads to the misunderstandings. It's what leads to not being heard. It's what leads to not being understood. It's what leads to not being respected. It's what leads to not feeling safe. It's what leads to not having that intimacy that you signed on for when you were in love. It's the culture impacting us as individuals, and we're not thinking about it. Well, I want you to start thinking about it. This series is pushing you to think about, what does masculine and feminine mean to me? And how can I express my masculinity in a way that's healthy in my marriage and healthy in society? And you know what? There are going to be times when you're walking down the wrong street with your wife, and you see what's coming down the street isn't good for either of you. And all of a sudden, that thing that we call toxic masculinity is going to be appropriate. And what that looks like is, honey, I want you to go find a cop. Take the kids and go find a cop and let me deal with this. Go back to the restaurant and call for help while I deal with this. And don't argue with me. Like in this situation, I know what needs to be done. You need to trust me on this. You can't help me by being here. If I'm spending my time trying to protect you while I'm defending you, defending myself, it won't work. I need you to go to find safety and get help while I slow this down so that you can get away. Now, that attitude in any other ecology might be seen as toxic, but in that ecology, it's appropriate. I'm now talking to men, obviously. So as men, I need you to get that some of the stuff we learned in the past has application today. We have an illusion of safety today. We need to be watching out to our families. We need to be prepared to be warriors when a warrior is called for. And we need to be gentle lambs when it comes to our family. And women, similarly, there's a time to kick ass and take names, and there's a time to be ecological. All right. So we have gone over this pretty extensively. I'm just going over my notes while I was like, I covered all this. The question really is, how do we embrace our masculine and feminine sides and find appropriate expressions? So I'm going to talk to men and women separately on this. And it's fully possible that I might be talking to a woman who's embraced her masculinity, or a man who's embraced his femininity but has discarded his masculinity, or she's discarded her femininity. I just wanted you to get whatever side of this balance you've been leaning into. This is what you need to do to balance it out. So if you've been leaning into the masculine, or you're a man, you need to embrace your linear approach to life, which is, I have a goal that I'm working towards. I'm a train on a track. But you need to make your primary goal in your marriage to prioritize emotional connection. So your primary goal in your marriage is to embrace, understand, and channel feminine qualities without losing your masculinity. We've talked about that in another episode also. That means you need to be able to express your emotions gently and in a way that is still authentic so that your wife can receive them. That means that you need to, when she's talking to you, honor her femininity by exercising your feminine side, even though it's less evolved than hers, and listening. That means that you need to save fixing, changing, and helping for when she asks for it or when you offer it and she accepts it. That means that you need to be present, not just productive. All right. You're not just getting stuff done. You are present. And you know what? I'm going to tell you something. When you're productive and emotionally present on your own, whether you like to work with your hands, whether you like to invest in the stock market, whether you like to deal with abstract concepts in the world of education, when you're emotionally present, when you allow that emotional connection to guide your linear thinking, you actually are going to have more satisfying and more filling results. It won't happen as fast always because the nature of ecological thinking is to explore. But when you take the time to explore and allow the process to unfold, instead of driving that train to the station as fast and as hard as you can, you will actually experience higher levels of fulfillment and satisfaction as a human being and start to see how your wife operates. And similarly, women, I want you to get that men process emotions differently. Get that just because he's not talking about it doesn't mean he doesn't care. Get that he's wired for directness, but he can talk about emotion. You may need to pull it out of him. You may need to explain to him why it's important to you. You may need to lay it out for him why expressing emotion will help him get to that place he wants to get with you in this situation, or that place he wants to get in this situation with you, depending on how you want to frame it. But when you tell him the why, he will be more likely to engage. He might not do it wholeheartedly. He may not do it as well as you would, but he will get there. And when you communicate clearly, when you communicate to men in terms of the goal, why you need it done this way in terms of the goal, they will make the connection between exploring the emotion and getting where they want to get. When you explore the emotion without making that connection for them, you don't show them that you really understand. So here's some actions you can take. I want you, ladies, to appreciate the effort that your man makes, particularly when it's around hearing and validating your emotion. And I want you to appreciate the effort that your woman makes when she honors your desire and need to be linear and gets that you're probably not trying to manipulate her directly or indirectly, that you're probably really just doing what you think is best. Gentlemen, I want you to take 5 minutes each day to ask your wife about how her day was and how she felt specifically. Not how was your day? Oh, you went to work good. Oh, you picked up the kids good. But how did you feel about your work day today? Hey, how was school? What did it feel like? Or how are the kids doing emotionally? I want you to focus on the emotional. And ladies, I want you to focus with your men on what did they accomplish today? Because the tendency of linear thinkers is to always feel like they aren't there yet, so they need to try harder. They're focused on the goal. Help them to focus on what they actually accomplished. Hey, I know that the goal is for us to do X, Y, and Z, or for you, for this car, or this house, or this whatever, have this position. What did you accomplish today that is helping you move towards that goal? Like, help them to acknowledge it and help them to have that feeling of success. So the key to thriving together is you don't need to be the same to have a great marriage. In fact, you aren't, and you shouldn't be. But you do need to show understanding, balance, and harmony with the other person. You do need to learn into that side of yourself that they embody and vice versa. The key is to understand and appreciate your differences and to lean into them instead of being resentful or feeling threatened. And also, as you're doing this, just notice how your own concepts of how it should be might not be in alignment with what works. Right? You may have some old ideas, old emotions that maybe your parents gave you hanging around. And it's worth it to explore it and air it out without shame and without guilt, right? The only way to air it out is to just you can have some guilt because guilt drives change. Guilt is the desire to see I have a behavior that's not working. I'd like to change that behavior so that it's more effective for myself and for my family. Shame is there's something wrong with me and I can't fix it. So without shame, the little guilt might be okay. I think the punchline here is, and we need to really work on leaning into what's already present for us, which is the femininity our mothers gave us, or our sisters gave us, or our aunts gave us, or whoever those female role models are. And women, when you lean into your masculinity, you want to do it in a way that doesn't invalidate your femininity, which is the cultural norm and probably what we've all unconsciously taken in. And so just look for ways to bridge that gap in your marriage and in yourselves. Hey, if you're liking what you're hearing here, if it's challenging you, if it's bringing up some stuff, awesome, right? This is not a podcast that's for everyone. Even though I'm like doing my best to honor all perspectives, it's not for everyone. Some people are going to hear this, they're going to hear misogyny. Some people are going to hear this, they're going to hear anti whatever you hear. And that's okay. Something that's powerful often brings up disagreement. And with that, I'm going to say, have a wonderful day, have an awesome tomorrow, and stay tuned for the next episode of Rich in Relationship.